What the waitress didn't know was that the quiet old woman she helped was the mother of one of the most powerful men in the city. Most people inside the small diner never noticed the quiet elderly woman sitting alone in the corner booth. But one waitress did. Every morning, Danielle Carter would bring her a warm breakfast and sit for a moment just to make sure she was okay. She never asked for money. She never expected anything in return. What Danielle didn't know was that someone was watching. Outside the diner window, a black car sat quietly at the curb. Inside it, billionaire Jonathan Whitmore watched the young waitress feed his elderly mother with a kindness he hadn't seen in a very long time. And in that moment, the powerful businessman made a decision that would soon turn Danielle Carter's entire life upside down. Just because sometimes the smallest act of kindness is witnessed by the one person who has the power to change everything. But what Jonathan Whitmore did next would stun her. The rain came down hard over South Chicago that night, thick drops bouncing off the cracked pavement like tiny explosions. Neon light from the Maple Street Grill flickered through the storm, casting red and blue reflections across puddles that stretched along the empty street. It was the kind of cold rain that seeped through jackets and settled deep in your bones. Most people hurried past the diner without looking inside. But one man didn't. Across the street, a long black Rolls-Royce sat quietly beside the curb, its engine humming softly beneath the steady rhythm of rain against the hood. The tinted windows hid the man inside from the outside world, but from where he sat, he could see everything through the diner's wide glass windows. Jonathan Whitmore leaned slightly forward in the back seat. He had been watching for nearly 10 minutes. Inside the Maple Street Grill, the late-night crowd had already thinned out. The smell of coffee, grease, and fried onions floated beneath the warm yellow lights that buzzed faintly overhead. A few truck drivers sat hunched over plates of food, while an old radio behind the counter played a soft blues song that almost drowned beneath the sound of rain hitting the roof. And near the corner booth, a young woman in a faded waitress uniform knelt beside a wheelchair. Her name was Danielle Carter. Her dark curls had been pulled back into a loose bun that was beginning to come undone after a long shift, as a thin strand of hair stuck to her cheek where rainwater had dried. Her uniform apron was slightly wrinkled, the pocket filled with order pads and a pen that had been taped together twice. She looked tired, but the way she moved was gentle. In front of her sat an elderly woman wrapped in a damp coat. Her silver hair clung to her temples, still wet from the storm. Her hands trembled lightly against the table, the veins beneath her pale skin visible beneath the harsh diner lights. Danielle held a spoon carefully in her hand. "Easy now," she said softly, her voice warm and patient. "It's still a little hot." She blew across the spoon before lifting it slowly toward the woman's mouth. The woman hesitated for a second before taking the bite. A small sigh escaped her lips. "Oh, that's wonderful," the old woman whispered. Danielle smiled. "Well, that's because our cook thinks salt is the answer to everything," she joked gently. The woman chuckled weakly. "Still better than hospital food." Danielle laughed quietly as she set the spoon back into the bowl of steaming soup. Outside, Jonathan Whitmore watched every movement. At first, he had only planned to stop by the diner quickly. He had received a message earlier that evening from his assistant. His mother had left her medical clinic appointment early and hadn't arrived home yet. The driver sent to pick her up had lost track of her. That alone had irritated him. But when his car turned onto Maple Street, he had spotted the familiar wheelchair through the rain-streaked window. And then he saw the waitress. Now he couldn't look away. Inside the diner, Danielle carefully adjusted the towel around the woman's shoulders. "You were really sitting out there in that rain?" Danielle asked, shaking her head. The woman nodded slowly. "My son was supposed to pick me up," she said quietly. Danielle didn't ask the obvious question. She simply reached for the mug of tea beside the bowl, and slid it closer. "Well, tonight you're stuck with me," Danielle said. The woman looked up at her. "You didn't have to bring me inside," she said softly. "You're probably closing soon." Danielle glanced at the wall clock above the register. 10:53 p.m., 7 minutes before closing. She shrugged. 7 minutes isn't going to make anyone rich, she said. The old woman studied her for a moment. "You're very kind." Danielle shook her head lightly. "No, ma'am," she replied. Just raised right." Outside the diner window, Jonathan Whitmore's expression shifted slightly. He recognized that voice. Not Danielle's, his mother's. The elderly woman sitting in that booth was Eleanor Whitmore, and she had been one of the strongest people he had ever known. For a moment, Jonathan felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Guilt. Inside the diner, Danielle lifted the spoon again. "Another bite?" she asked. Eleanor nodded. Danielle fed her carefully, patiently, the way someone might care for a grandparent. There was no rush in her movements, no irritation, no expectation of reward. Just quiet kindness. Jonathan noticed the details most people would miss. The way Danielle steadied the bowl so Eleanor's trembling hands wouldn't spill it. At the way she wiped a drop of soup from the edge of the spoon before lifting it again. The way she listened when Eleanor spoke, leaning forward slightly like the words actually mattered. No cameras, no audience, no reason for performance. Just a tired waitress helping a stranger. The rain continued to fall harder outside. Inside the Rolls-Royce, Jonathan sat perfectly still. The driver glanced back once. "Sir, should I bring Mrs. Whitmore home?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the scene inside the diner. Danielle had finished the soup now. She pushed the empty bowl aside and handed Eleanor a napkin. "There we go," Danielle said softly. "Thank you," Eleanor replied. Danielle shrugged again. "Not a big deal." But Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No," she said quietly. It is." Danielle looked confused. Before she could respond, the diner door opened and a gust of cold wind swept inside. Tony, the cook, leaned out from the kitchen window. "Hey, Danny," he called. "You planning on adopting customers now or what?" Danielle laughed. "Relax, Tony. I'm almost done." Tony grumbled and disappeared back into the kitchen. Danielle turned back to Eleanor. "Your ride coming soon?" Eleanor hesitated. "I'm not sure," she admitted. Danielle thought for a moment. "Well," she said, "we'll figure it out." Outside, Jonathan Whitmore slowly leaned back against the leather seat. He had built companies worth billions. He had negotiated deals across continents. He had spent decades learning how to read people. And what he saw inside that diner surprised him. Because the woman helping his mother had no idea who Eleanor Whitmore was. No idea she was the mother of one of the wealthiest men in Chicago. No idea that the quiet man watching from across the street controlled a corporate empire. And yet she treated Eleanor like someone who mattered. Jonathan exhaled slowly. "Interesting," he murmured. The driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Sir?" Jonathan didn't respond. Across the street, Danielle helped Eleanor adjust the blanket around her legs. "You feeling warmer?" Danielle asked. Eleanor nodded. "Much." Danielle smiled. "Good." Outside, the rain softened slightly. Inside the Rolls-Royce, Jonathan Whitmore made a quiet decision. But he didn't open the car door. Not yet. Instead, he continued watching through the diner window. While watching the waitress, who had no idea that the simple act of feeding an old woman a bowl of soup was about to change her life forever. And for the first time in many years, Jonathan Whitmore found himself wondering something unusual. Who exactly was Danielle Carter? And why did it feel like he had just witnessed something rare? The rain tapped gently against the glass as the Rolls-Royce remained parked in the shadows. And inside the diner, Danielle laughed softly at something Eleanor said, completely unaware that the man sitting across the street was quietly deciding what to do next. Because tomorrow morning, he planned to walk through those diner doors. And when he did, Danielle Carter's world would never be the same again. But that night, Danielle had no way of knowing it. By the time the rain finally slowed to a drizzle, on Maple Street Grill was closing. The neon sign flickered twice before Tony reached behind the counter and flipped the switch, leaving only the soft glow of the kitchen lights reflecting off the windows. Danielle stood beside Eleanor's wheelchair, helping her pull her coat tighter. "You sure you don't want me to call someone?" Danielle asked gently. Eleanor smiled faintly. "My son is very busy," she said. "He'll send someone eventually." Danielle nodded. She had heard that kind of sentence before. In her neighborhood, it usually meant the person wasn't coming anytime soon. "Well," Danielle said, grabbing her own jacket from the hook behind the counter, "I'm not leaving you out here." Tony walked past carrying a trash bag and shook his head. "Danielle, you gonna adopt every stray you find in the rain?" Danielle rolled her eyes. "Just helping someone get home, Tony." Tony grunted but didn't argue. A few minutes later, Danielle pushed Eleanor's wheelchair slowly down the wet sidewalk. The cold night air smelled like rain and gasoline from passing cars. Streetlights reflected across puddles as buses roared by in the distance. Danielle stopped under the awning outside the diner. "Okay," she said, pulling out her phone. "Let's see if we can get you a ride." Eleanor watched her quietly. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. Danielle shrugged. "I know." She tapped at the cracked screen of her phone, opening a rideshare app. The estimated price popped up. Danielle hesitated. $23. Her jaw tightened slightly, but she pressed confirm anyway. "There we go," she said, forcing a cheerful tone. Car will be here in 8 minutes." Eleanor studied her face. "You paid for that yourself, didn't you?" Danielle waved the question away. "It's fine." But inside, Danielle was already calculating. $23 meant Malik's lunch money for 2 days. Still, she didn't regret it. A cold gust of wind swept down the street. Danielle pulled her jacket tighter. "You got family nearby?" she asked. Eleanor nodded slightly. "My son lives downtown." Danielle whistled. "Fancy area." Eleanor smiled. "He's worked very hard." Danielle leaned against the wall beside the wheelchair. "Must be nice." For a moment, neither of them spoke. A bus roared past, spraying water across the curb. Eleanor finally said quietly, "What about you?" Danielle gave a small laugh. "Oh, I'm just surviving." She pointed down the street. "Bronzeville apartment building about 3 blocks that way. Nothing special." "You live alone?" Danielle hesitated. "No," she said. "My son and I." Eleanor's eyes softened. "How old?" 8. "What's his name?" "Malik." Danielle smiled faintly. "He's the reason I get up every morning." Eleanor nodded slowly. "You must be very proud of him." Danielle's expression warmed. "He's a good kid." The rideshare car arrived a few minutes later, headlights cutting through the damp air. Danielle helped Eleanor into the back seat, carefully folding the wheelchair and sliding it into the trunk. Before closing the door, Eleanor reached for Danielle's hand. "Thank you," she said softly. Danielle shrugged again. "Just promise me you'll stay out of the rain next time." Eleanor chuckled. "I'll try." The car pulled away, disappearing into the wet glow of city lights. Danielle stood there for a moment, watching the taillights fade. Then she turned and began the walk home. 3 blocks didn't sound like much. But after a 12-hour shift, every step felt heavier. Her shoes were soaked. Her fingers were cold. When she finally reached the brick apartment building, the hallway lights flickered overhead. The elevator was broken again, so Danielle climbed the stairs quietly to the 3rd floor. Inside apartment 3B, a small lamp glowed beside the couch. Malik was asleep. He had curled up with his backpack still beside him, a homework sheet half finished on the coffee table. Danielle smiled tiredly. She knelt beside him and brushed a curl from his forehead. "Hey, baby," she whispered. Malik stirred slightly. "You home?" "Yeah." "Did you eat?" Danielle hesitated. "Of course." He nodded sleepily and drifted back to sleep. Danielle stood slowly and walked into the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator. Inside was half a carton of milk and a small container of leftover rice. That was it. She closed the door quietly. Then she leaned against the counter and exhaled. Another long day. Another night wondering how she was going to make rent. She rubbed her eyes before grabbing a glass of water instead of food. In the living room, the TV flickered silently with late-night news. A reporter stood in front of a massive glass building downtown. "Whitmore Industries continues to dominate Chicago's manufacturing sector," the anchor said. CEO Jonathan Whitmore announced a new expansion earlier today. Danielle barely glanced at the screen. Billionaires lived in another universe. She switched the TV off. Across the city, inside a penthouse office high above the skyline, Jonathan Whitmore stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Whitmore Tower. The rain had stopped. Below him, Chicago glittered with thousands of lights. His assistant stepped quietly into the room. "Mrs. Whitmore is home safely," she said. Jonathan nodded. "And?" She mentioned the waitress again. Jonathan's expression remained calm. "What did she say?" The assistant checked her tablet. "She said the young woman refused any tip and paid for her ride home." Jonathan's gaze shifted back to the city. "Interesting. Do we know her name?" "Yes." The assistant tapped the screen again. "Danielle Carter, 29, works at Maple Street Grill, single mother." Jonathan absorbed the information silently. Outside the glass windows, the skyline stretched endlessly into the night. Finally, he said, almost to himself, "A woman who can barely afford groceries, paying for someone else's ride." The assistant waited. Jonathan turned slowly from the window. "Find out when her next shift is." The assistant blinked. "Sir?" Jonathan picked up his coat. "Tomorrow," he said calmly. "I'm having breakfast at Maple Street Grill." Across the city, Danielle Carter slept on the couch beside her son, unaware that the most powerful man in Chicago had just decided to walk into her diner. And when he did, everything was about to change. Morning came slowly to South Chicago. The sun rose pale behind low gray clouds, casting a soft glow across the brick buildings of Maple Street. Delivery trucks rattled down the street, their engines echoing through the cool air as shop owners unlocked doors and swept yesterday's dust from their sidewalks. Inside Maple Street Grill, the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the diner. Danielle Carter had already been on her feet for 2 hours. Her shift started before sunrise. By 6:15 a.m., she had brewed 3 pots of coffee, wiped down every table, and refilled the sugar dispensers along the counter. Tony was already complaining from the kitchen. "You know what I don't understand?" he shouted through the pass window. Danielle didn't look up as she stacked clean plates. "What's that, Tony?" "People who order eggs well done." She smiled faintly. "Maybe they don't like runny yolks." Tony shook his head. "That's not eggs. That's punishment." Danielle laughed softly. The morning crowd had started to arrive. Construction workers in heavy boots filled the corner tables. A pair of bus drivers sat near the window sharing a plate of pancakes. The diner hummed with quiet conversation and clinking silverware. Danielle moved quickly between tables, her worn sneakers barely making a sound against the tile floor. Coffee refills, orders taken, smiles given, even when the tips were small, especially when they were small. At 7:08 a.m., the bell above the diner door rang. Danielle glanced up automatically and froze. Outside the window, a black Rolls-Royce had just pulled up along the curb. The entire diner seemed to pause. Two construction workers at the counter leaned toward the window. "Man, is that a Rolls?" Tony leaned out of the kitchen. "Oh, no way that car belongs on Maple Street." The driver stepped out first. He walked around the car and opened the rear door. And then the man inside stepped onto the sidewalk. Tall, impeccably dressed, dark overcoat, sharp eyes that seemed to scan everything at once. Even the noisy diner fell strangely quiet when he walked in. The bell above the door rang again. Jonathan Whitmore stepped inside Maple Street Grill. Danielle had never seen him before, but something about him felt different. Not flashy, not arrogant, just quietly powerful. The kind of presence that made people sit up a little straighter without knowing why. Jonathan paused just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the warm yellow lights of the diner. Then he looked directly at Danielle and walked toward her. Danielle blinked once and then quickly grabbed a menu. "Good morning," she said politely. "Table for one?" Jonathan nodded. "If that's all right." His voice was calm, controlled. Danielle led him to a booth near the window. She placed the menu on the table. "Coffee?" "Yes, please." She returned a moment later with a fresh mug and a steaming pot. Jonathan watched her movements carefully. She didn't recognize him. That much was clear. Most people did. His face appeared in business magazines, on news broadcasts, even on billboards downtown. But Danielle simply poured the coffee like she would for any other customer. "Cream or sugar?" "Black is fine." She nodded. "You ready to order?" Jonathan glanced at the menu, though he had barely looked at it. "What do you recommend?" Danielle smiled slightly. "Oh, well, Tony makes a pretty solid breakfast skillet." Jonathan closed the menu. "I'll trust you." Danielle scribbled the order down. "Coming right up." As she walked back toward the kitchen window, Tony leaned forward. "Who's the suit?" "No idea," Danielle said. Tony peeked toward the booth. "That guy's watch probably costs more than this whole diner." Danielle shrugged. "He ordered eggs." Tony shook his head. "Rich people eat eggs too, huh?" Danielle laughed quietly. Minutes later, she returned with the breakfast skillet, steam rising from the hot iron pan. She placed it carefully in front of Jonathan. "Careful. Plate's hot." Jonathan nodded. "Thank you." Danielle turned to leave when Jonathan spoke again. "Excuse me." She looked back. "Yes?" Jonathan studied her face for a moment. You helped an elderly woman here last night." Danielle's brow furrowed slightly. "Oh, you mean the lady in the wheelchair?" Jonathan nodded slowly. Danielle smiled. "Yeah, sweet lady." "You fed her." Danielle shrugged. "She hadn't eaten much." "You paid for her ride home." Danielle shifted slightly. "Well, she needed one." Jonathan watched her carefully. "Why?" Danielle blinked. "What do you mean? Why did you help her?" Danielle laughed softly. "That's a strange question." Jonathan said nothing. Danielle leaned lightly against the edge of the booth. "Because she needed help." "That's all?" Danielle nodded. "That's enough reason." Jonathan looked down at his plate for a moment. Then he looked back up. "You didn't know who she was?" "Nope," You didn't expect anything in return. Danielle smiled. Sir, well, if I helped people expecting something back, I'd have quit this job years ago. Jonathan felt the corner of his mouth lift slightly. That woman, he said quietly, was my mother. Danielle blinked. Oh. She straightened up immediately. Well, I hope she got home safe. She did. Danielle nodded, relieved. That's good. Jonathan studied her expression. No surprise. No sudden politeness. No attempt to impress him. Just simple relief that the old woman had gotten home safely. Jonathan leaned back in the booth. You're Danielle Carter. Danielle frowned slightly. How do you know that? Jonathan gestured toward the name tag pinned to her uniform. Danielle laughed. Oh, right. Jonathan slid his coffee cup aside. I'd like to ask you something, Ms. Carter. Danielle crossed her arms lightly. Oh, depends what it is. Jonathan looked her directly in the eye. How would you feel about leaving this diner and working for me instead? For a moment, Danielle thought she had misheard him. Tony dropped a spatula in the kitchen. The construction workers near the counter turned slightly. Danielle stared at Jonathan Whitmore. I'm sorry, she said slowly. What exactly do you mean by that? Jonathan folded his hands on the table. I run a company downtown, he said calmly. I know who you are now, Danielle replied. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. You do? Danielle nodded. Tony just texted me under the counter. Jonathan almost laughed. Danielle tilted her head. So let me get this straight. She pointed toward the window where the Rolls-Royce still sat outside. You're a billionaire. Yes. And you came into a small diner in South Chicago? Yes. To offer a waitress a job. Jonathan nodded once. Danielle stared at him for another long second. Then she laughed. Not rudely, just in disbelief. You're serious? I am. Danielle rubbed her forehead. Okay, she said slowly. Now I'm really curious. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. So am I. Danielle looked him straight in the eye. What kind of job does a billionaire think a diner waitress is qualified for? Jonathan Whitmore smiled faintly. That, he said, is exactly what I'd like to find out. And suddenly, the quiet morning inside Maple Street Grill felt like the beginning of something much bigger than anyone in the diner realized. For a moment, Danielle simply stared at him. The diner noises slowly crept back into the room. The clink of forks, the hum of the coffee machine, Tony muttering in the kitchen. But everything around Danielle felt strangely distant. She folded her arms across her apron. Okay, she said slowly. You're serious. Jonathan nodded once. Danielle leaned slightly against the booth, studying him. She had seen wealthy men before. Occasionally they came through the diner after business meetings downtown. They usually talked loudly, tipped poorly, and never made eye contact with the staff. Jonathan Whitmore was different. He sat calmly, hands folded, as if offering a stranger a job was the most normal thing in the world. Danielle shook her head with a soft laugh. You know I've never worked in an office before, right? Jonathan took a sip of his coffee. I'm aware. And I don't have a fancy degree. I know. And the only thing on my resume is this diner. Jonathan's eyes stayed steady. That's the part I'm interested in. Danielle blinked. She wasn't sure if he was joking. You're interested in pancakes and coffee refills? Jonathan leaned forward slightly. I'm interested in someone who helps people when no one is watching. Danielle hesitated. That's not exactly a corporate skill. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the diner. Construction workers laughing, Tony yelling at a grill, an elderly man carefully counting coins at the register. "This place," Jonathan said quietly, "is full of people trying to get through the day." Danielle nodded slowly. "That's most of Chicago." Jonathan looked back at her. "And yet last night, you still chose to help someone who couldn't give you anything in return." Danielle shrugged. "That's just being decent." Jonathan studied her face. "You'd be surprised how rare that is." Danielle felt heat rise slightly to her cheeks. She wasn't used to being studied like that. "So what exactly is this job?" she asked. Jonathan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black business card. He slid it across the table. Danielle picked it up. "Whitmore Industries." The silver lettering caught the light. Her eyes widened slightly. "Vice offices? Downtown tower?" Jonathan nodded. "That's right." Danielle whistled softly. "Yeah, I've seen that building." Everyone in Chicago had. It dominated the skyline like a glass mountain. "So what do you want me to do there?" Danielle asked. Jonathan leaned back in the booth. "I'd like you to come in tomorrow," he said. "Sit in on a few meetings." Danielle blinked again. "Meetings?" "Yes. I serve eggs," Danielle said. Jonathan almost smiled. "People are people, Ms. Carter, whether they're eating breakfast or running companies." Danielle looked down at the card again. Her fingers traced the silver letters. Something about this felt unreal. Across the diner, Tony leaned over the counter and whispered loudly, "Danny, if that guy's offering a job with health insurance, take it." Danielle shot him a look. Tony shrugged and returned to the grill. Danielle turned back to Jonathan. "You just met me," she said. "That's true. You don't know anything about me." Jonathan's expression softened slightly. "I know enough." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really?" Jonathan rested his elbows lightly on the table. "You're a single mother." Danielle stiffened. "How do you know that?" "You mentioned your son last night." Danielle slowly relaxed again. "Right." Jonathan continued calmly. "You paid for my mother's ride even though you couldn't afford it." Danielle didn't respond. "You fed her before feeding yourself." Her eyes shifted slightly. "And you never once asked who she was." Danielle looked at the window. Rainwater still clung to the glass from the night before. After a moment, she said quietly, "She reminded me of my grandmother." Jonathan waited. "She used to say," Danielle continued, "that kindness is the only thing people carry with them when everything else is gone." Jonathan's voice softened. "Your grandmother sounds wise." Danielle smiled faintly. She raised me." Silence settled between them. Finally, Danielle sighed and shook her head. "This is crazy." Jonathan didn't argue. "It probably is." Danielle tapped the business card lightly against the table. "And if I say no?" Jonathan shrugged. "Then you keep working here." "And that's it?" "That's it." Danielle studied him carefully. "You're not going to pressure me?" "No." "Or offer me $1 million?" Jonathan laughed quietly. "No." Danielle leaned back. "Good." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Danielle smiled. "Because if you did, I'd know this was a trick." Jonathan looked amused. "And you don't think it is?" Danielle shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "I think you're serious." Jonathan nodded once. "I am." The morning sunlight began to break through the clouds and casting a soft glow across the diner floor. Danielle stood there holding the card, thinking. Behind her, the diner buzzed with life again. Orders shouted, coffee poured, plates clattered, her normal world. Jonathan finished the last of his coffee. "Well," he said, standing slowly, "you don't have to decide right now." Danielle looked up. "Tomorrow morning," he continued. 10 o'clock. He nodded toward the card in her hand. "The address is on there." Danielle swallowed slightly. "And if I don't show up?" Jonathan buttoned his coat. "Then I'll know your answer." He placed a few bills under the coffee mug. Danielle glanced down. It was far more than the cost of breakfast. Jonathan noticed. "That's for the food," he said calmly. Danielle pushed the extra bills back across the table. You already paid." Jonathan looked at her. She folded his hand around the money again. "Just the breakfast," she said. For a moment, Jonathan said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "Understood." He turned toward the door. The bell above it rang as he stepped outside. The Rolls-Royce driver opened the rear door again. Jonathan paused for one last glance through the window. Danielle still stood there holding the card, looking like someone who had just been handed a door to another life. Jonathan climbed into the car. The engine started. Across the street, Maple Street Grill returned to its ordinary morning rhythm. But Danielle Carter stood very still beside the booth. Her heart was beating faster now. Tony leaned out of the kitchen again. "So, what was that about?" Danielle looked down at the card in her hand. Whitmore Industries. She swallowed. "I think," she said quietly, "my life just got really complicated." And somewhere deep inside her chest, something she hadn't felt in a very long time slowly began to wake up. Hope. But Danielle Carter still had one question echoing in her mind. What exactly happens when a billionaire opens a door meant for someone like her? That question followed her the rest of the day. It followed her as she refilled coffee cups and wiped tables. It followed her while Tony burned another batch of bacon and complained about the rising cost of eggs. It even followed her when the lunch rush came in and the diner filled with the loud rhythm of plates and voices. Danielle moved through it all on instinct. Smile. Take the order. Bring the food. But her thoughts were somewhere else. And every time her hand brushed against the apron pocket, she felt the sharp corner of the black business card resting there. Whitmore Industries. It felt heavier than paper should. Tony noticed before noon. "You're spacing out," he said from behind the grill. "I'm not. You poured coffee into a guy's orange juice." Danielle blinked. "Did I?" Tony nodded slowly. "Danny, that billionaire scrambled your brain." Danielle grabbed a towel and wiped down the counter harder than necessary. "I'm just thinking." Tony raised an eyebrow. "That's dangerous." Danielle didn't answer. The rest of the shift dragged on. By the time the afternoon light stretched long across Maple Street, Danielle finally tied off her apron and clocked out. The walk home felt shorter than usual. Her mind was racing. Bronzeville always had its own rhythm in the afternoon. Kids rode bicycles along cracked sidewalks. A woman watered plants from a second-floor balcony. Music drifted from an open car window somewhere down the block. It was loud, alive, real. Danielle pushed open the door to her apartment building and climbed the stairs. Inside apartment 3B, Malik was sitting at the small kitchen table with a math workbook. He looked up immediately. "You're home." Danielle smiled. "Hey, baby." Malik jumped up and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You smell like pancakes." "That's the price of the job." He returned to the table while she pulled leftovers from the refrigerator. 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, cut diagonally. Malik talked while he ate. "Ms. Ramirez said if I pass my reading test, I get to move up a level." "That's great." "And Jamal says his mom might get a new car." Danielle nodded, half listening. Malik noticed. "You're thinking." Danielle blinked. "What?" "You do that thing with your eyebrows when you think." Danielle laughed softly. I do not. You do. He leaned forward. What happened? Danielle hesitated. Then she reached into her pocket and placed the black business card on the table. Malik picked it up. Whitmore Industries, he read slowly. That's a big company, right? Danielle nodded. The biggest. Malik's eyes widened. You got hired? Danielle shook her head. Not exactly. She told him the story. About the man in the diner. About the offer. About the office downtown. Malik listened quietly. When she finished, he asked the question she had been avoiding all day. So, are you going? Danielle leaned back in her chair. I don't know. Malik frowned. Why not? Danielle searched for the right words. Because people like that don't usually ask people like us to work with them. Malik shrugged. Maybe he just liked you. Danielle smiled faintly. Maybe. Malik slid the card back across the table. If you don't go, he said, you'll always wonder. Danielle stared at the card. Whitmore Tower, 10 o'clock, a door she had never imagined opening. That night she barely slept. Morning arrived gray and quiet. Danielle stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the only decent blouse she owned. It was simple, pale blue, slightly faded at the collar. She brushed Malik's hair before school. You look nervous, he said. I am. He grinned. Good luck. Danielle walked him to the bus stop. When the bus pulled away, she stood there for a moment, watching it disappear down the street. Then she took a deep breath. Downtown Chicago felt like another world. The buildings rose higher with every block. Glass towers reflected the sky like mirrors. Expensive cars slid silently along polished streets. And then she saw it. Whitmore Tower. The building stretched upward like a sheet of silver and glass. People in suits flowed in and out of the entrance. Danielle stood across the street for nearly a minute. Her stomach twisted. What am I doing here? A black car pulled up beside the curb. The same driver from the diner stepped out. Ms. Carter? Danielle turned. Yes. Mr. Whitmore asked me to make sure you found the entrance. Danielle blinked. Oh. The driver opened the door. Inside the lobby, everything was quiet and polished. Marble floors, tall windows, a receptionist behind a curved white desk. Danielle suddenly felt very aware of her worn shoes. The receptionist looked up. Yes? Before Danielle could answer, a familiar voice spoke behind her. She's with me. Danielle turned. Jonathan Whitmore stood there, coat over his arm. Good morning, Ms. Carter. Danielle let out a small breath. Morning. Jonathan gestured toward the elevators. Ready to see what a billion-dollar company looks like from the inside? Danielle hesitated. Then she nodded. They stepped into the elevator. The doors slid closed. The ride up felt silent and strangely long. Finally, Jonathan said, You almost didn't come. Danielle glanced at him. Oh, how did you know? Jonathan smiled slightly. Most people in your position wouldn't. Danielle looked at the rising floor numbers. Most people in my position don't get invited. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. And Danielle Carter stepped out into a world she had never imagined being part of. But she had no idea that behind those polished glass walls, someone was already waiting for her to fail. The executive floor of Whitmore Tower was quiet, in a way Danielle had never experienced before. Not the noisy quiet of a diner between lunch rushes. This was controlled quiet. Carpeted floors softened every footstep. Glass walls reflected the soft morning light pouring through the windows. Assistants moved calmly between desks with tablets in hand, speaking in low professional voices. Danielle suddenly felt like she had stepped onto another planet. Jonathan Whitmore walked beside her, as if the space belonged to him, which, in many ways, it did. "This floor houses most of the executive offices," he said calmly. Danielle nodded, trying not to stare too obviously. Men and women in tailored suits glanced up as they passed. Some recognized Jonathan instantly, but their attention shifted almost immediately to Danielle, the waitress in second-hand clothes walking beside the CEO. She could feel their curiosity like heat on her skin. Jonathan stopped outside a large glass conference room. Inside, 6 people sat around a polished table reviewing documents projected on a large screen. Jonathan pushed the door open. The room fell silent immediately. "Good morning," Jonathan said. The executives straightened. Once a tall, gray-haired man seated near the center closed his laptop slowly. His eyes landed on Danielle and stayed there. "This," Jonathan continued calmly, "is Danielle Carter." Danielle gave a small, polite nod. No one returned it. Jonathan pulled out a chair. "She'll be sitting in today." The gray-haired man's expression didn't change, but something in the room shifted. Tension. "This is an executive strategy meeting," the man said carefully. His voice was smooth, but the message was clear. Jonathan met his gaze calmly. "I'm aware." The man leaned back slightly. "And Ms. Carter's role here would be—" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Observation." The man folded his hands. "I see." He looked directly at Danielle now. His smile was polite, but cold. "Richard Caldwell," he said. "Oh, Chief Financial Officer." Danielle nodded. "Nice to meet you." Caldwell's smile didn't move. "Likewise." But inside his mind, the thought was very different. What exactly is Whitmore doing? The meeting resumed. Charts appeared on the screen. Sales numbers, factory reports, supply chain projections. Danielle tried to follow along, but the conversation moved fast. Terms she had never heard filled the air. Quarterly margins, capital restructuring, operational efficiencies. She sat quietly, listening, watching. About 20 minutes in, the topic shifted. A factory in Indiana. Caldwell tapped the screen. "This facility has been underperforming for 3 consecutive quarters," he said. The screen displayed a photograph of an aging manufacturing plant. "Labor costs are high. Output is declining." He clicked again, and a new slide appeared. Closure proposal. Danielle felt a strange tightening in her chest. "How many employees?" someone asked. "Just over 1,000, Caldwell replied. The room remained quiet. Jonathan leaned slightly forward. "What are the alternatives?" Caldwell answered immediately. "There aren't any that make financial sense." He pointed to the numbers. "The board will expect decisive action." Danielle raised her hand slightly without thinking. The room turned toward her. Caldwell's eyebrows lifted. Jonathan nodded toward her. "Yes, Danielle." She hesitated, then spoke. "Those are people." Silence. Caldwell blinked slowly. "Yes," he said. "They are employees." Danielle shook her head. "I mean, families?" Caldwell gave a thin smile. "This is a business discussion." Danielle leaned forward slightly. "My mom worked at a factory," she said quietly. Caldwell didn't respond. "When it closed," Danielle continued, "half our neighborhood lost their jobs." The room remained still. Jonathan watched her carefully. Danielle glanced at the screen again. 1,000 people losing work doesn't just stay inside a building, she said. It spreads. Caldwell folded his arms. "And your solution would be?" Danielle hesitated. "I don't know all the numbers," she admitted. But closing it sounds like the easy answer. Caldwell's voice sharpened slightly. This company exists to generate profit. Danielle nodded. I get that. She looked around the table. But people are the reason you make it. For a moment, no one spoke. Jonathan finally leaned back in his chair. Interesting perspective. Caldwell's jaw tightened slightly. This meeting is not a social experiment, he said calmly. Jonathan turned to him. No, he agreed. It's about decisions. Caldwell held his gaze. And emotional arguments won't change the math. Danielle lowered her eyes slightly. Maybe she had said too much. The meeting moved on, but something in the room had shifted. Jonathan noticed it. Caldwell noticed it even more. When the meeting ended, executives gathered their laptops and left quickly. Danielle stood awkwardly beside the table. Sorry if I interrupted, she said quietly. Jonathan shook his head. You didn't. But across the room, Richard Caldwell watched her carefully. As the others exited, he approached Jonathan. May I speak with you privately? Jonathan nodded. Danielle stepped out into the hallway. Through the glass wall, she could see Caldwell speaking quietly but intensely. Jonathan listened, calm, unmoved. Finally, Caldwell turned and glanced toward Danielle. His eyes narrowed slightly. Back inside the room, his voice dropped lower. She's not qualified to be here. Jonathan's answer was simple. I know. Caldwell's frustration slipped through. She challenged a financial decision based on feelings. Jonathan folded his hands. Sometimes feelings reveal problems spreadsheets don't. Caldwell leaned closer. With respect, Jonathan, this company cannot run on diner philosophy. Jonathan's expression didn't change. No, he agreed. But it also can't survive without understanding people. Caldwell straightened slowly. This is a mistake. Jonathan said nothing. Caldwell gathered his tablet and walked out. As he passed Danielle in the hallway, he paused. His voice was quiet. You may think you're helping people, he said, but you have no idea how dangerous this building can be. Danielle frowned slightly. Dangerous? Caldwell smiled thinly. Corporate decisions ruin lives every day. Then he walked away. Danielle stood there for a moment, unsettled. Jonathan stepped into the hallway. Don't worry about him, he said. Danielle glanced down the corridor, where Caldwell had disappeared. I think he really doesn't like me. Jonathan almost smiled. That probably means you're doing something right. But down the hall, inside his private office, Richard Caldwell closed the door and stared out at the skyline. His mind was already calculating. While Jonathan Whitmore, bringing a waitress into executive meetings, challenging factory closures, questioning financial decisions. This could destroy months of planning. Caldwell picked up his phone. If she's going to stay, he murmured quietly, she'll need to learn her place. And somewhere in the depths of Whitmore Tower, the first pieces of a quiet trap were already beginning to take shape. Danielle, of course, had no idea. She stood near the long window at the end of the executive hallway, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The city stretched in every direction, buildings stacked like glass dominoes, the river winding through them like a ribbon of steel. From up here, everything looked calm, orderly, controlled, and it didn't look like the same city where buses screeched around corners and rent notices slid under apartment doors. Jonathan stepped beside her. You did well in there, he said. Danielle laughed softly. I think your CFO would disagree. Jonathan glanced down the hallway where Caldwell had disappeared. He values efficiency, Jonathan replied. Danielle folded her arms. He looked at me like I spilled coffee on his spreadsheet. Jonathan smiled faintly. That's not far from the truth. They walked together toward another part of the floor. Employees moved past them, some nodding respectfully to Jonathan, others pretending not to stare at Danielle. She noticed the looks, the curiosity, the quiet judgment. She had grown up recognizing those expressions. "You don't belong here." Jonathan stopped outside a smaller office with glass walls. "Temporary workspace," he said, opening the door. Inside was a simple desk, a computer, and a chair that probably cost more than Danielle's couch. "You can use this while you're here," Jonathan said. Danielle stepped inside carefully. Everything felt spotless. Even the air smelled expensive. "You're really serious about this," she said. Jonathan leaned against the doorframe. "I told you I was." Danielle sat slowly in the chair. "So, what exactly am I supposed to do?" Jonathan considered the question. "Pay attention," he said. "To what?" "People." Danielle frowned slightly. "I already do that." Jonathan nodded. "That's why you're here." Before Danielle could respond, there was a knock at the open door. A young man stepped in, carrying a laptop. He looked about 30, with messy brown hair and tired eyes behind thin glasses. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "you asked for the network reports." Jonathan nodded. "Lucas, this is Danielle Carter." Lucas blinked slightly. "Oh." Danielle smiled politely. "Hi." Lucas recovered quickly. "Nice to meet you." Jonathan gestured toward the desk. "Lucas runs most of our internal systems." Lucas chuckled. "That's a generous way of saying I fix everyone's broken computers." Danielle laughed. "That sounds familiar." Lucas looked confused. "I fixed the coffee machine at the diner too." Lucas grinned. "Then you're already overqualified." Jonathan checked his watch. "I have another meeting," he said. "Lucas will help you get access to the system." Danielle's eyes widened. "The system?" Lucas held up the laptop. "Oh, nothing complicated," he assured her. "Just internal reports." Jonathan looked at Danielle one last time before leaving. "Take the day," he said. "Learn how the company works." Then he was gone. Danielle sat there quietly for a moment. Lucas pulled up a chair beside the desk. "So," he said, opening the laptop. "First day in corporate America." Danielle exhaled. "I feel like I accidentally walked into the wrong building." Lucas smiled sympathetically. "Honestly, most of us feel that way." He turned the screen toward her. Charts filled the display. Factory production numbers, shipping data, employee statistics. Danielle leaned forward. "This is the Indiana factory they talked about?" Lucas nodded. "Yeah." Danielle studied the numbers. "How long has it been struggling?" Lucas shrugged. "Oh, a while." "Could it actually recover?" Lucas hesitated. "Maybe." Danielle looked at him. That sounded like a no. Lucas scratched the back of his neck. "Let's just say the financial department has already decided what they want to happen." Danielle remembered Caldwell's voice. Closure proposal. Her chest tightened again. Lucas noticed. "You really meant what you said in there, didn't you?" Danielle nodded. "People matter." Lucas leaned back in his chair. "You're going to have a hard time convincing the board of that." Danielle sighed. "Yeah, I figured." Across the building, inside his corner office, Richard Caldwell stood with another executive. "She challenged the closure plan," Caldwell said quietly. The man frowned. "A waitress?" "Yes." "That's embarrassing." Caldwell's expression remained calm. It's inconvenient." He opened a folder on his desk. Inside were financial projections, contracts, internal memos, months of preparation. Everything pointing toward the factory shutdown. Everything pointing toward the deal he had already arranged with a private investment group. If the plant closed, the land would be sold, and Caldwell would quietly earn millions in consulting fees. But Danielle Carter had just complicated everything. "She can't stay," the executive said. Caldwell nodded slowly. "She won't." Back in Danielle's temporary office, Lucas continued explaining the company structure. Departments, production chains, supply routes. Danielle listened carefully, absorbing everything. At one point, she looked up from the screen. "Why are you helping me?" Lucas shrugged. "Oh, because you asked questions in that meeting that no one else does." Danielle smiled faintly. "That's because I don't know what I'm supposed to say yet." Lucas laughed. "Don't learn too fast." The afternoon passed quickly. By the time the sun began to drop behind the skyline, Danielle's head was spinning with information. She packed her small notebook and stood. "Thanks, Lucas." "No problem." As she walked toward the elevators, she noticed something strange. Two executives standing near the hallway stopped talking when she approached. Their voices dropped. Eyes followed her. The same looks she had felt all day. Suspicion. Dismissal. The elevator doors closed. Danielle leaned against the wall. The ride down felt longer this time. Outside the tower, the city air felt different again. Louder. More familiar. She walked toward the bus stop slowly. Inside her bag, the notebook was full of questions. About factories, about jobs, about decisions made in rooms she had never imagined entering. But deep inside Whitmore Tower, Richard Caldwell was already preparing the next move. Because if Danielle Carter stayed close to Jonathan Whitmore, she might start asking questions that no one in that building wanted answered. The next morning in Chicago arrived cold and clear. A thin layer of sunlight stretched across the glass face of Whitmore Tower, turning the entire building into a mirror reflecting the sky. Cars rolled quietly along the streets below, and office workers poured through the lobby doors like clockwork. Danielle Carter stood on the sidewalk across the street. For a moment, she simply looked up. The building still felt unreal. Once yesterday she had stepped inside as a guest. Today she was coming back. Her bus had dropped her off 2 blocks away, and the walk had given her too much time to think. People in suits passed her without noticing. But Danielle noticed them. Their confidence, their rhythm, the quiet certainty that they belonged here. She inhaled slowly and crossed the street. Inside the lobby, the marble floor gleamed beneath the bright morning lights. The receptionist from yesterday recognized her immediately. "Good morning, Miss Carter." Danielle blinked slightly. "Morning." It still felt strange hearing someone call her that in a place like this. The elevator ride up felt slightly less terrifying this time. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, Lucas was already waiting near the glass wall outside her temporary office, and he lifted a coffee cup in greeting. "You survived day 1, Danielle smiled. "Barely." Lucas handed her the coffee. "Peace offering." She took a sip. "This is actually good." "Corporate coffee budget," Lucas said proudly. Danielle laughed. They walked into the office together. Her notebook from yesterday was still on the desk. Danielle opened it and stared at the pages filled with scribbled questions. Factory output, labor costs, transport routes. Lucas glanced over her shoulder. "You did homework." Danielle shrugged. "If I'm going to sit in those meetings again, I'd like to know what people are talking about." Lucas nodded approvingly. "Fair." He sat on the edge of the desk. "Another strategy meeting this morning." Danielle groaned slightly. "Great." Lucas tilted his head. "Oh, you're not nervous?" Danielle considered that. "A little." Lucas grinned. "You should be." The meeting room filled quickly again. Executives arrived with laptops and tablets. Some barely glanced at Danielle. Others watched her carefully. Richard Caldwell entered last. His expression remained perfectly controlled. But when his eyes met Danielle's, the briefest flicker of irritation passed through them. Jonathan Whitmore entered moments later. "Let's begin." The meeting resumed with updates from several departments. Danielle listened carefully this time. When the Indiana factory appeared on the screen again, the air in the room shifted. Caldwell stood beside the display. "As discussed yesterday," he said smoothly, "the closure plan remains the most efficient option." He clicked the remote. Graphs filled the screen. Operating losses continue to grow. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. "What about restructuring?" Caldwell answered immediately. "Too costly." Danielle glanced down at her notebook. Her hand moved before she even realized it. She raised it slightly. Caldwell paused. "Yes?" Danielle hesitated, then spoke. "The numbers yesterday didn't include transport adjustments." Caldwell's expression tightened almost invisibly. "Excuse me?" Danielle opened her notebook. "I was looking at the distribution routes last night." Several executives exchanged glances. "You're shipping materials from 3 different suppliers," Danielle continued. Lucas shifted slightly in his chair. "That's correct," Caldwell said. "But the Indiana plant is closer to 2 of them than your other factories," Danielle said. The room went quiet, as Caldwell's voice cooled. "And your point?" Danielle swallowed slightly. "If you shift the routes, you cut transportation costs." Lucas leaned forward suddenly. "She's right." Caldwell turned slowly toward him. Lucas pulled up something on his laptop. "Wait," he said. He tapped rapidly. The large screen updated. New numbers appeared. Several executives leaned closer. Lucas blinked. "Well, that's interesting." Jonathan watched silently. Lucas turned the laptop so others could see. "If we reroute supply chains," he said carefully, "the operating losses drop by almost 40%. A murmur moved through the room. Caldwell's jaw tightened. "That doesn't solve the labor cost problem." Danielle shook her head. "But it buys time." Caldwell looked directly at her. "And time costs money." Danielle met his gaze. "So does firing 1,000 people." The room went silent again. Jonathan finally spoke. "Lucas, run the full projection." Lucas nodded quickly. "Already doing it." Caldwell folded his arms. "This is speculation." Jonathan glanced at him. "Or opportunity." Caldwell didn't respond. Danielle felt her heart pounding. She hadn't planned to say any of that. But now it was out there. Numbers continued to appear on the screen. Lucas looked up slowly. "Well," he said, "this changes things." Caldwell stared at the projection. His voice dropped lower. "It complicates things." Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "Which means the closure decision is postponed." Caldwell didn't argue, but his eyes moved toward Danielle again. And this time the irritation was gone, replaced by something colder: calculation. And after the meeting ended, the executives filed out more slowly than usual. Several glanced back at Danielle, some curious, some annoyed. Lucas walked beside her in the hallway. "That was impressive." Danielle exhaled. "I thought I was about to get thrown out." Lucas laughed. "You might have just saved a factory." Across the corridor, Caldwell watched them from the doorway of his office. 1,000 employees, millions of dollars, months of planning, all disrupted by a diner waitress and a few supply routes. He stepped back inside his office and closed the door quietly. His phone buzzed on the desk, a message from a private investor group. "When is the closure confirmed?" Caldwell stared at the screen for a moment, then typed a reply. "Soon." He set the phone down, and his eyes drifted back toward the glass wall overlooking the executive floor. toward the small office where Danielle Carter now sat reviewing factory reports. His voice was barely a whisper. "Let's see how well you survive your first real corporate scandal." Because the trap he had been preparing was almost ready. For the rest of the week, Whitmore Tower buzzed with quiet tension. Danielle could feel it in the hallways. Conversations stopped when she passed. Executives who had ignored her on the first day now studied her with open curiosity. A few even nodded politely, but not everyone. Richard Caldwell rarely spoke to her directly after the meeting, yet his presence lingered like a shadow across every room she entered. Danielle tried to ignore it. She focused on learning. Every morning she arrived early, and sitting with Lucas while he explained reports and supply chains. By afternoon, she followed Jonathan into meetings, listening more than speaking. The corporate world was complicated, but it wasn't as mysterious as people made it sound. Numbers were still just numbers, and decisions still affected real people. Late Thursday afternoon, Danielle sat alone in her temporary office reviewing a file Lucas had sent over. Production statistics from the Indiana factory. The building outside the window glowed orange as the sun lowered behind the city skyline. Danielle rubbed her eyes. She had never studied this much in her life. A soft knock sounded on the glass wall. She looked up. Richard Caldwell stood there. For a moment, Danielle hesitated. Then she stood. "Mr. Caldwell?" He stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. But his expression was calm, almost friendly. "I thought we should speak," he said. Danielle nodded slowly. "About the factory?" Caldwell gave a faint smile. "Partly." He walked toward the desk, glancing at the reports on her screen. "You've made quite an impression here." Danielle shifted slightly. "I'm just asking questions." Caldwell nodded. "That's the problem." Danielle frowned. "I thought companies liked questions." Caldwell folded his hands. "Good companies like the right questions." The air between them felt colder now. Danielle leaned against the desk. "Is there something specific you wanted to say?" Caldwell studied her for a moment. "You should be careful, Ms. Carter." "Careful?" "You're new here," he continued calmly. "You don't understand the politics." Danielle crossed her arms. "I'm not interested in politics." Caldwell smiled thinly. "That's what makes you dangerous." Before Danielle could respond, her phone buzzed on the desk, an internal company notification. "Lucas." Danielle glanced at it quickly. His message was short. "Check your email. Now." Her stomach tightened. "Excuse me," she said. Caldwell stepped aside politely. Danielle opened her email. The subject line made her heart drop. "Urgent. Internal investigation." She clicked it. A document opened. Her name appeared near the top. Danielle Carter. Unauthorized data transfer. Her pulse raced. "What is this?" she whispered. Caldwell leaned slightly closer. Security flagged an unusual activity in the network. Danielle scrolled through the report. Timestamps, file access logs, sensitive corporate data. Her hands began to shake. I didn't do this." Caldwell's voice remained calm. "The system shows otherwise." Danielle looked up at him. "I've barely touched the system." Caldwell tapped the screen. "According to this, confidential files were downloaded from your workstation last night. That's impossible. Security will review it." Danielle's chest tightened. "Who received the files?" Caldwell shrugged lightly. "That's what we're trying to determine." The word hung in the air. Espionage. Corporate theft. Danielle felt the room spinning slightly. "I would never—" The door suddenly opened. Lucas rushed in. "Don't sign anything," he said immediately. Caldwell turned slowly. "This is an internal investigation." Lucas ignored him. He walked straight to Danielle. I checked the server logs. Danielle looked at him desperately. Lucas, I didn't. I know, Lucas said. He turned his laptop toward her. The timestamps were altered. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. That's a serious accusation. Lucas didn't look at him. The download didn't come from Danielle's login. Danielle's breath caught. Then whose? Lucas hesitated. Someone used administrator credentials. Caldwell stepped closer. Many people have admin access. Lucas finally looked up. Not many who were logged in at 2:17 a.m. The room fell silent. Danielle's eyes moved slowly between the two men. Someone framed me? Lucas nodded. It looks that way. Caldwell straightened his jacket calmly. Or perhaps someone is trying to cover their tracks. Danielle stared at him. You think I did this? Caldwell didn't answer directly. But your name is attached to the activity. Lucas closed his laptop. This is a setup. Caldwell's voice remained perfectly controlled. That will be determined by the investigation. Danielle felt her throat tighten. The same building that had looked like opportunity 2 days ago now felt like a courtroom, a place where she didn't belong. Lucas leaned closer to her. Don't panic, he whispered. But panic was already spreading. Danielle's mind raced. Her son. Her job at the diner. Her reputation. If the company accused her of corporate theft, her life could collapse overnight. Caldwell watched her reaction carefully. Exactly as planned. He stepped toward the door. Security will contact you shortly. Danielle looked up sharply. I didn't do anything. Caldwell paused. His expression remained unreadable. That, he said quietly, is exactly what we'll find out. He left the office. The door closed with a soft click. Danielle sat slowly in the chair, her hands still trembling. Lucas pulled a chair beside her. This isn't over, he said. Danielle looked at the email again. Her name. Corporate espionage. Unauthorized data transfer. The words felt unreal. Why would someone do this? She asked quietly. Lucas's expression darkened. Because you changed the factory decision. Danielle swallowed. You think someone here set me up? Lucas nodded slowly. I do. Outside the glass walls of Whitmore Tower, the sun slipped behind the skyline. And for the first time since Danielle Carter had stepped into Jonathan Whitmore's world, she realized that kindness alone might not be enough to survive it. No, the office felt smaller after Caldwell left. The sunset outside had turned the sky a deep orange, but inside Danielle's chest everything felt cold and tight. She stared at the investigation email again. Unauthorized data transfer. Corporate security review pending. Her name appeared in bold letters. Danielle closed the laptop slowly. I'm going to lose this job before I even started it, she said quietly. Lucas shook his head immediately. No, you're not. Danielle looked at him. You saw the report? I also saw the logs, Lucas replied. He opened his laptop again, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The timestamps were manipulated. Danielle leaned closer. So someone with higher access changed them? Lucas nodded. And they were careful. The screen filled with scrolling lines of server data. Oh, but not perfect. Danielle didn't understand half of what she was seeing. Numbers, codes, user permissions. Lucas zoomed in on a section. There, he said. Danielle squinted. What am I looking at? Security authentication. Lucas tapped the screen. The system shows your login, but the network handshake came from a different workstation. Danielle blinked. So, someone logged in as me. Exactly. Her stomach tightened again. Can you prove it? Lucas hesitated. I can prove something's wrong. Danielle leaned back slowly. But that's not the same thing. Lucas closed the laptop halfway. No. The office grew quiet. Outside the glass wall, employees were beginning to leave for the evening. Danielle rubbed her temples. My son is expecting me home in an hour, she said softly. Oh, and right now my name is attached to corporate theft. Lucas leaned forward. Jonathan will believe you. Danielle shook her head. This isn't about belief. She pointed toward the email. This is about evidence. Before Lucas could answer, a soft voice spoke from the doorway. You're right about that. Both of them turned. Eleanor Whitmore stood in the hallway. Danielle blinked in surprise. Mrs. Whitmore? The older woman stepped inside slowly, leaning lightly on a polished wooden cane. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head. She wore a dark coat, elegant but simple. Her eyes were sharp, much sharper than Danielle remembered from the diner. I hope I'm not interrupting, Eleanor said calmly. Lucas stood quickly. Mrs. Whitmore. Danielle looked between them. You work here too? Eleanor smiled slightly. No. She walked further into the office, her gaze moving to the laptop on the desk. I just visit when things get interesting. Danielle frowned slightly. Interesting? Eleanor nodded. My son called me. Danielle's heart skipped. Jonathan knows? Eleanor tilted her head. Of course. Danielle felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. I swear I didn't. Eleanor raised a hand gently. I know. Danielle stopped. You do? Eleanor stepped closer to the desk. I spent 20 years investigating corporate fraud, she said calmly. Lucas blinked. You did? Eleanor smiled faintly. For the federal government. Danielle's eyes widened. You're serious? Eleanor nodded. Very. She leaned slightly over the laptop screen. Show me the logs. Lucas opened the file again. Eleanor studied it silently, and her eyes moved quickly across the code. For a moment, the room filled only with the soft hum of the computer. Then Eleanor spoke. This was sloppy. Lucas blinked. Sloppy? She pointed at the screen. They changed the timestamps but forgot to adjust the server handshake. Lucas's eyes widened. That's what I saw. Eleanor nodded. It means the login came from another terminal. Danielle leaned forward. Can you track which one? Lucas hesitated. Maybe. Eleanor straightened slowly. You don't have much time. Danielle swallowed. What do you mean? Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. In corporate investigations, the first report shapes the narrative. Lucas understood immediately. If security finishes before we prove anything, Eleanor nodded. Then Danielle becomes the suspect. Danielle felt the pressure returning to her chest. So what do we do? Eleanor looked between them. We follow the trail. Lucas began typing again, faster now. The system logs refreshed. Lines of data scrolled across the screen. Lucas suddenly stopped. Oh. Danielle leaned closer. What? Lucas turned the laptop slightly. Admin credentials. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Which admin? Lucas hesitated. Someone high up. Danielle felt her pulse quicken. Who? Lucas swallowed. The system trace leads to... He stopped. Eleanor looked at him carefully. Say it. Lucas exhaled slowly. Caldwell's department. The room went silent. Danielle stared at the screen. You're telling me the CFO framed me? Lucas shook his head quickly. I'm saying the login came from a terminal assigned to financial administration. Eleanor's voice remained calm. That narrows it down considerably. Danielle leaned back in her chair. Her mind raced. Caldwell's warning earlier echoed in her ears. You should be careful. Eleanor folded her hands over the cane. Corporate traps are rarely complicated, she said. They're just timed well. Danielle looked at her. Oh, why would he do this? Eleanor's eyes moved toward the skyline outside. The Indiana factory. Lucas nodded slowly. If the plant stays open, someone loses money. Danielle whispered, and that someone might be Caldwell. Eleanor turned back to them. If that's true, he'll push the investigation quickly. Danielle's hands tightened. So, we have to prove the truth before he finishes the lie. Eleanor smiled slightly. Exactly. Lucas looked up from the laptop. I might be able to pull the full server trace. Eleanor nodded. Do it. Danielle looked at both of them. A diner waitress, a network engineer, and a retired fraud investigator, standing in a corporate office trying to outmaneuver one of the most powerful executives in the company. The situation would have been absurd if it weren't so real. Outside Whitmore Tower, the city lights flickered on one by one. Inside the office, the quiet battle for Danielle Carter's future had just begun. Lucas barely blinked as he worked. The glow of the laptop screen lit his face while lines of system data streamed across the display. The office had grown darker as the evening settled over Chicago, but no one noticed. Danielle stood beside the desk with her arms folded tightly, watching the scrolling code like it might suddenly turn into words she could understand. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the window. From the outside, she looked calm, almost patient, but the sharp focus in her eyes told a different story. Lucas stopped typing suddenly. I found it. Danielle leaned forward immediately. What? Lucas enlarged a section of the log. This is the server authentication trail, he said. He highlighted a line. The login that downloaded the files came through an admin override. Eleanor stepped closer. That means someone with executive clearance. Lucas nodded. And the request came from this terminal. He typed another command. A location appeared on the screen. Danielle stared. That's... Lucas finished the sentence. Caldwell's office. Silence fell across the room. Danielle exhaled slowly. So it was him. Lucas hesitated. Technically, the terminal. Eleanor nodded. But it's enough to start asking the right questions. Danielle rubbed her forehead. Will anyone believe us? Eleanor turned toward her. That depends on how we present it. At that moment, the office door opened. Jonathan Whitmore stepped inside. He had removed his jacket, his tie slightly loosened from the long day. His eyes moved quickly across the room. Tell me you found something. Lucas turned the laptop toward him. Jonathan studied the screen quietly. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked at Danielle. You weren't lying. Danielle let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Of course I wasn't. Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. Caldwell moved faster than I expected. Eleanor spoke calmly. Because he has something to lose. Jonathan nodded. The Indiana plant. Danielle looked between them. He wanted it closed that badly? Jonathan walked toward the window. Yes. Lucas turned his laptop again. There's more. Jonathan looked back. Lucas pulled up another document. A private investment group filed a land acquisition inquiry 2 weeks ago. Eleanor's eyebrows lifted. Before the closure proposal? Lucas nodded. And the contact on the inquiry, he paused, was Caldwell. Danielle stared. So if the factory closed, Jonathan finished quietly, the land would be sold. Eleanor's voice remained steady, and Caldwell would profit. The room fell silent again. Jonathan looked down at the floor for a moment. Then he straightened. Tomorrow morning, he said, we present this to the board. Danielle's eyes widened. The board? Jonathan nodded. They deserve to know what's happening inside this company. The next morning arrived cold and gray. Whitmore Tower stood tall against the cloudy sky as executives filed into the main boardroom. The room was large and quiet, the long table surrounded by leather chairs. Members of the board reviewed documents while assistants set down coffee trays. Richard Caldwell arrived early. His expression was confident. He had already prepared the final closure presentation for the Indiana plant. Everything was moving exactly as planned, or so he believed. The door opened. Jonathan Whitmore entered. Behind him walked Danielle Carter, Lucas, and Eleanor Whitmore. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" he asked. Jonathan took his seat at the head of the table. "An update." The board members looked between them with curiosity. Jonathan nodded toward Lucas. "Go ahead." Lucas connected his laptop to the display. The screen lit up. Server logs appeared, data trails, authentication records. Caldwell's confidence faded slightly. "What exactly are we looking at?" one board member asked. Jonathan answered calmly. "Evidence." Lucas highlighted the timestamp. This login triggered the data transfer that started the internal investigation. Another click. The screen zoomed in. "Notice the terminal ID." The room grew quieter. Lucas clicked again. The office location appeared. Financial Administration Terminal, assigned user, Richard Caldwell. Caldwell stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous." Eleanor stepped forward slightly. "The timestamps were altered," she said calmly, "but the server handshake was not." Several board members exchanged looks. Jonathan spoke quietly. "The investigation against Danielle Carter was based on falsified data." Caldwell shook his head. "This is a misunderstanding." Lucas pulled up the final document. The land acquisition inquiry, the private investor communication. Caldwell's name attached. The room fell completely silent. One of the board members spoke slowly. "Mr. Caldwell, care to explain?" Caldwell looked around the table. For the first time, he had no immediate answer. Jonathan leaned back slightly in his chair. "Corporate decisions affect real people," he said. "And sometimes, those decisions reveal who we really are." Security entered the room quietly. Caldwell's shoulders sank. The board members watched in stunned silence as the CFO of Whitmore Industries was escorted out. Danielle stood near the wall, still processing everything. The trap had been meant for her, and now the truth had turned it around. Jonathan turned toward the board. "The Indiana plant will remain open while we review restructuring." Several members nodded, but Jonathan's gaze moved toward Danielle. "And I'd like to introduce someone who helped make that possible." The room looked at her. For a moment, Danielle felt the same fear she had on her first day. But this time, something else stood beside it. Respect. Jonathan spoke clearly. "Danielle Carter. The woman who reminded this company that numbers are only part of the story." And for the first time since stepping into Whitmore Tower, Danielle Carter realized she wasn't just surviving this world. She was changing it. For a moment, the boardroom remained completely silent. The executives around the long table looked at Danielle differently now. Not with curiosity, not with doubt, with something closer to respect. Danielle felt the weight of their eyes, and for a second, the same nervous feeling from her first day returned. Her hands instinctively moved to the edge of the chair in front of her, the way she used to steady herself while balancing plates in the diner. Jonathan Whitmore noticed. He stood slowly. "Let's take 5 minutes," he said calmly. Chairs shifted. Young board members murmured quietly among themselves as assistants stepped forward to refill coffee cups. Danielle remained near the wall, unsure what she was supposed to do next. Lucas leaned toward her with a quiet grin. "Well," he said softly, That escalated. Danielle exhaled. You think? Lucas nodded toward the hallway where security had taken Caldwell. You just helped expose the most powerful financial officer in the company. Danielle shook her head slightly. I just didn't want 1,000 people to lose their jobs. Lucas smiled. Exactly. Across the room, Eleanor Whitmore approached slowly with her cane. Her expression held the same calm intelligence Danielle had seen the night before in the office. You did well, Eleanor said. Danielle shook her head. I almost didn't. Eleanor tilted her head. Oh, almost? Danielle looked down for a moment. If Lucas hadn't checked the logs, if you hadn't seen the mistake. Eleanor interrupted gently. But you asked the first question. Danielle looked up. Eleanor smiled. That's how truth usually begins. Jonathan returned to the head of the table. The board members settled into their seats again. The room felt different now. Less tense. More focused. Jonathan rested his hands lightly on the table. There are 2 decisions we need to make today, he said. The board members listened carefully. First, the Indiana factory. He nodded toward the screen behind him, where the earlier projections remained. With the updated logistics model Danielle suggested, the plant can remain operational while we restructure. One board member spoke. Oh, how long would that take? Lucas answered from his seat. 6 months to stabilize production. Another member nodded. That's reasonable. Jonathan looked around the table. Then the plant stays open. Several people murmured their agreement. Danielle felt something warm rise in her chest. 1,000 families. Jobs saved. All because someone had looked at the numbers differently. Jonathan continued. The second decision concerns leadership. The room grew quiet again. Jonathan turned slightly toward Danielle. Over the past week, Ms. Carter demonstrated something this company desperately needs. He paused. Perspective. A board member leaned forward. You're suggesting a formal role? Jonathan nodded. I am. Danielle's eyes widened. Jonathan spoke clearly. I'd like to create a new position within Whitmore Industries. He glanced toward Danielle. Vice President of Community Strategy. The words hung in the air. Danielle blinked. I'm sorry. What? Jonathan smiled faintly. You understand how our decisions affect people outside these walls. Danielle looked around the room. I'm not a corporate executive. Jonathan nodded. That's exactly why you're qualified. One board member laughed quietly. Hard to argue with the results. Another nodded. Agreed. Danielle felt completely overwhelmed. Her mind raced back to Maple Street Grill. The smell of coffee. Tony yelling at the grill. The cracked tile floors. How would this even work? She asked quietly. Jonathan answered simply. You help us see the world the way our workers see it. Lucas leaned toward her again. You'd still get coffee, he whispered. Danielle laughed despite herself. Eleanor watched her carefully. Kindness, Eleanor said softly, is a powerful leadership skill. Danielle thought about that. All the years of struggling. All the times people had told her kindness didn't matter in a hard world. And yet here she was, inside one of the most powerful companies in the country. Jonathan extended a folder across the table. Inside was a contract. Danielle hesitated. You don't have to answer today, Jonathan said. But Danielle already knew. She looked around the room once more. Then she nodded. I'll do it. The board members smiled. Lucas clapped quietly. Eleanor simply nodded with quiet satisfaction. Later that evening, Danielle stepped out of Whitmore Tower into the cool Chicago air, while the city lights shimmered across the river. Her phone buzzed. A text from Malik. Did the big building eat you? Danielle laughed softly. She typed back, "No, but it tried." A moment later, another message arrived. "Did you get the job?" Danielle looked up at the tall glass tower behind her, the building that had once felt impossible. Then she typed, something like that. When Danielle arrived home, Malik was waiting on the couch. He jumped up the second she opened the door. "So?" Danielle knelt beside him. "Well," she said, "looks like your mom has a new job." Malik's eyes widened. "In the big building?" Danielle nodded. Malik wrapped his arms around her neck. "That's amazing." Danielle held him tightly. Across the city skyline, Whitmore Tower glowed against the night. Inside, decisions would still be made. Her numbers would still matter. But something had changed. Because one small act of kindness inside a diner had reminded an entire company that business wasn't just about profit. It was about people. And sometimes the person who changes the system is the one no one expected to be there in the first place. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and share where you're watching from. And here's something simple I'd love to ask you. If you believe kindness can still change someone's life, type 1 in the comments. If you think the world needs more people like Danielle, type 2. You don't have to write a long message. Just a 1 or 2 lets us know you're here. I read the comments every day, and I love seeing where our viewers are watching from all around the world. And if you enjoy stories like this, stories about courage, but kindness, and unexpected moments that change everything, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because the next story might surprise you even more. There's another incredible story coming very soon, and you won't want to miss it.